Today, if you feel sick, you tap a screen and a doctor appears within minutes. In 1900, if you fell ill in rural America, you waited for the sound of hooves in the dark and prayed the doctor could reach you before dawn. In the winter of 1900, in the rolling farmland outside of Des Moines, Dr. Elias Whitaker buttoned his heavy wool coat against the wind and stepped onto his porch before sunrise. The fields were frozen silver, the fences lined with frost, and the only sound was the restless shuffle of his bay horse, Mercy, tied to the hitching post. There were no paved highways, no ambulances, no emergency rooms glowing under electric light in every town. In much of rural America, the country doctor was the hospital, the pharmacy, the surgeon, and often the only hope. Elias had graduated from a small medical college in Chicago in the early 1890s, at a time when American medicine was transforming but still dangerously primitive. The germ theory of disease had gained acceptance only a few decades earlier, thanks to European scientists like Louis Pasteur. Antiseptic surgery was spreading after the discoveries of Joseph Lister, but in the countryside, theory traveled more slowly than disease. Many farm families still trusted home remedies, mustard plasters, onion syrups, and tonics sold by traveling salesmen before they sent for a physician. Dr. Whitaker's practice covered nearly 200 square miles of farmland and small settlements. On a good day in summer, he might ride 15 miles between patients. In winter, when snow swallowed the roads and rivers froze over, that distance could take hours. He carried his world in a worn leather medical bag, glass bottles of tinctures, laudanum for pain, quinine for fevers, a stethoscope made of polished wood, suturing needles, and a small tin box of surgical instruments he boiled over kitchen stoves before use. On this particular January morning, a farm boy had ridden through the night to fetch him. The Jensen's family's youngest daughter, Clara, was burning with fever and struggling to breathe. Pneumonia was a common killer then. Before antibiotics, a simple lung infection could end a life in days. Elias mounted Mercy and followed the boy through icy wind across open prairie. Twice they had to dismount and push through snowdrifts. The cold cut into his cheeks, but he urged the horse onward. When he reached the Jensen's farmhouse, he found Clara lying near the iron stove, her small chest rising in shallow, rapid breaths. The air smelled of kerosene and fear. He knelt beside her, listening with his wooden stethoscope, hearing the crackling sound in her lungs. There was no X-ray machine, no oxygen tank, no intensive care unit. All he had were his training, his experience, and the fragile hope that her body was strong enough to fight. He mixed a mustard poultice to place on her chest, prescribed careful hydration, and instructed the family to keep the room warm but ventilated. He stayed for hours, monitoring her breathing, timing her pulse with a pocket watch. When her fever finally dipped slightly by evening, the entire family wept in relief. Elias accepted payment not in cash, there was rarely enough, but in cured ham, winter potatoes, and a promise of labor to repair his barn come spring. This was the quiet economy of rural medicine in 1900. According to the U.S. Census of that year, nearly 40% of Americans lived on farms. Hospitals were growing in cities like New York City and Boston, but in places like central Iowa, most births and deaths occurred at home. Doctors rode horseback or drove horse-drawn buggies along rutted roads. They crossed rivers without bridges and navigated by memory when storms erased landmarks. Elias delivered babies by lantern light, coached anxious fathers through boiling water and clean sheets, and sometimes performed emergency procedures on kitchen tables scrubbed with lye soap. Childbirth was perilous. Maternal mortality rates were shockingly high by modern standards. Yet when a newborn's cry filled a farmhouse at midnight, it felt like a miracle wrestled from darkness. In the spring of 1901, a different threat swept through the countryside: diphtheria. The bacterial infection could suffocate children by forming a thick membrane in the throat. An antitoxin had been developed in the 1990s, a breakthrough of modern science, but obtaining it in remote areas was difficult.
When word reached Elias that several children in a nearby settlement were ill, he rode nearly 30 miles to the nearest rail station to retrieve vials shipped from a larger city. He kept them packed in ice, praying they would not spoil before he returned. He administered the antitoxin carefully, one trembling child at a time. Not all survived. Medicine in 1900 was a battle often fought without certainty, but enough lived that families began to see him not just as a doctor, but as a bridge between their isolated world and the rapidly advancing century beyond their fields. The country itself was changing. The 20th century had dawned with industry booming and cities rising. The Spanish-American War had ended only 2 years earlier. Railroads stitched the nation together, and telegraph wires carried news faster than any horse could run. Yet in rural townships, life still followed the rhythm of seasons. When storms washed out roads, Elias could be cut off for days. Once, during a summer thunderstorm, he forded a swollen creek to reach a farmer whose leg had been crushed under a plow. The cold nearly swept mercy from beneath him. He arrived soaked and shaking, but managed to set the fractured bone and splint it with carved wood and bandages torn from clean linen. There were nights he returned home long before midnight, too tired to eat. His wife Margaret kept a ledger of debts owed and payments received in eggs, milk, or firewood. They lost a son to scarlet fever in 1898, a cruel reminder that even a doctor's knowledge could not shield his own family from the era's harsh realities. Grief etched lines into his face, but it also deepened his resolve. Every patient became someone's child. By 1905, change was reaching even his quiet county. Automobiles, still rare and unreliable, sputtered along city streets. Medical schools were beginning to standardize training, a reform that would accelerate after the famous Flexner report a few years later. Sterilization techniques improved. Public health campaigns promoted sanitation and vaccination. Elias read medical journals by lamplight, determined not to fall behind the science transforming his profession. Eventually, he purchased a second-hand automobile, temperamental, loud, and prone to breakdown, but faster than any horse on a dry road. Farmers gathered to watch him crank it to life, half amused, half skeptical. Yet even with this mechanical marvel, the essence of his work remained unchanged: long distances, fragile lives, and the trust of families who opened their doors at any hour. One autumn evening in 1908, Clara Jensen, the same girl he had treated for pneumonia years before, ran across a harvested field to greet him as he arrived to tend to her ailing grandfather. She was tall and strong now, her lungs healthy, her laughter bright against the golden stibble of corn. "Ma says you gave me back my life," she told him shyly. Elias smiled, though he knew the truth was more complicated. Medicine in 1900 was as much about presence as prescriptions. It was about showing up through blizzards and darkness, about steady hands and steady hearts. It was about convincing frightened families that they were not alone. When he finally retired in the 1920s, the world was almost recognizable compared to the one he had entered as a young physician. Hospitals were better equipped, antibiotics were on the horizon, automobiles replaced horses, yet for decades, across frozen fields and muddy spring roads, he was the lifeline of his community. Today, we measure healthcare in data, technology, and speed, but in 1900 rural America, healthcare was measured in miles traveled, nights without sleep, and the courage to ride into uncertainty. And somewhere in the quiet memory of the Midwest, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the fading echo of hooves carrying a doctor toward a farmhouse light. Proof that long before modern medicine's miracles, there were men and women who carried hope in a leather bag and delivered it one patient at a time.